Những người vô thần vì không tin có Thượng Đế, không tin có Thiên Chúa, cho nên cuộc sống của họ đôi khi có thể tìm đủ mọi cách để tích lũy, để thu gom, để trà đạp, để đạt được cái địa vị danh vọng mà bất chấp nỗi khổ đau của người khác. Bởi vì họ nghĩ rằng làm gì có đời sau, thì tại sao đời này chúng ta không chành lấy, chúng ta không kiếm lấy, và chúng ta không thu gom để sống cho hưởng thụ.
But today we're addressing another statement which is so deeply insulting, moronic, and downright inappropriate that I find it shocking that our society finds it acceptable for any group of people to say it about any other group of people. And that is, if you're an atheist, then you have no reason not to rape someone. Now, of course, this is demonstrably not true. I mean, I'm an atheist, and I have reasons not to rape people. So I guess the actual issue here is that if you're a Christian and you can't think of a non-religious reason not to rape someone, then all that means is, well, I guess I'm glad you're not an atheist, because me, you have major issues of psychopathy to work through before you give up your religion. The first thing that should be pointed out is just how totally presumptuous this statement is. If someone is seriously at a loss for why another person wouldn't rape, then the minimally respectful and constructive thing to do would be to ask why they think rape is wrong, instead of telling them they don't have any reasons. For a Christian to assume that they fully grasp your atheism and the ways it impacts your personal decision-making process, and not only that, but to claim that they understand it so well that they can tell you have no motivation for not raping someone is just, well, arrogant. Now at this point we need to be very careful about something, and that's to avoid making assumptions about Christians' motivations. Part of the problem here is their proclivity toward making unfair assumptions about our motivations. So in addressing a problem with how they communicate with us, we need to avoid jumping to conclusions about why they communicate the way they do. Thus, when I say this comment is arrogant, I don't mean all Christians intend to be arrogant when they make it. Now, I generally think most people who say this are being at least a little headed on some level, but in all sincere fairness, there can be all kinds of reasons that their religious mindset or some other factor has made this statement a sincere expression of how they understand morality. But regardless of intent or attitude, the fact is that this statement is functionally arrogant insomuch as it unfairly and unnecessarily degrades atheists and serves as an outright conversation stopper. And this is all before we consider the fact that it purposefully selects one of the most irredeemably horrible things one person can do to another to use as ammunition against us. So be polite, assume the Christian is probably just a decent person repeating some apologetic he or she heard, but recognize that this is not an okay thing to say to you. But back to the core issue, the reasons we humans do and don't do things are too varied and complex for one person to fully grasp. And it's important to recognize that other people may have good reasons for their behavior that you might not understand. So that said, are there good reasons, other than religion, for not raping someone? And how can we communicate these to a believer? I think this is easily addressed using a little thought experiment. Imagine you are isolated in a room with an attractive young woman, and speaking purely in terms of physical impulses, you have a very powerful urge to have sex with her. But she has made it clear that she does not wish to do the same with you. Now, to make this only about morality, we'll say that there are absolutely no social or legal consequences for any action you might take. It's just you and the other person alone in the room, and that's it. Except, oh yeah, God's supposed to be around, right? And according to the Christian, that's the only moral reason you shouldn't rape her. Right? Well, that's where we need to introduce a variable into this experiment, which we'll do by breaking this down into two scenarios. In scenario A, God exists. In scenario B, he does not. Once you've made this distinction, I would find it very informative to ask the Christian what he would do in each. If I asked about scenario A, I think we can all predict what the Christian would say. I would not rape the young woman because of God. Fine. So then, of course, I'd ask, would you rape her in scenario B? This presents the Christian with a tough choice. If he says no, then he clearly has a non-religious reason not to rape, and thus atheists can have reasons not to rape. If he says yes, then, well, he's a horrible person, and the reason this answer would make him a horrible person illuminates the actual foundation of morality. See, I would suggest that in these scenarios, stripped clean of societal or legal implications, there are two proposed reasons not to rape. One is that God would be upset by the act, and the other is that it would cause a horrifying level of harm and distress to the victim. But when a Christian says there's no reason not to rape without God, he's suggesting that he doesn't find the second reason compelling. I find this disturbing and morally reprehensible, and I'd guess that deep down the Christian does too, which is why he would probably try to skirt the issue by saying something like, well, I'm not the type of person who would rape, but without God it still wouldn't be objectively wrong for everybody. There are several inconsistencies in this answer that deny the basic premises of the thought experiment, but instead of getting bogged down in arguing the technicalities of what I meant, I would just make an alteration to scenario B, and that would be to add another person to the room who wishes to rape the young woman. What would the Christian do then? Would he intervene to stop the attacker? I suggest that if he would sit back and choose not to intervene, he's as horrible a person as if he committed the act himself. But I think the Christian would intervene, and he would think anybody else in the situation should too, which shows he recognizes that there is something other than God that makes rape fundamentally and universally wrong. And on a side note, if he were to claim that he can't say how he'd act in a godless universe because he doesn't know how to answer hypotheticals, then guess what? He just admitted he can't speak to how we should act based on our disbelief in God. Now, it should be obvious that harm to the victim in and of itself makes rape wrong, and in fact it's the main and most compelling reason whether or not God exists. What's more, I personally think this is the more compelling of the two reasons even for Christians, which is why, when reading scriptures that tell of God commanding the Israelites to capture virgin girls for their own use, Christians ignore the obvious meaning behind these verses, meaning they alter their readings of scripture, thus their view of God, to conform with how they feel about the impact of rape on the victim, while I highly doubt most would change how they feel about rape to conform with scripture. When confronted with decency versus God, decency very often wins, at least with most Christians we'll interact with. So when a Christian says you have no reason not to rape if you're an atheist, here are a few things you can calmly and politely bring up. 1. You believe rape is wrong because of the harm caused to the victim. 2. The harm done to the victim compels you not only to not rape, but to stop others from raping. 3. Your obligation to a potential rape victim is at least as important and objective as Christians' obligation to God. If they argue this point, you might bring up some of the thought experiments we discussed, or possibly ask them to honestly ponder whether, if they encountered a victim of sexual assault, they would be more bothered by the suffering of the victim or the fact that God was offended. Depending on your relationship with a person and how honest they wish to be with themselves, this should get them thinking. And finally, you could also add that, 4. Questions of objectivity aside, the fact is that they, like most people, would both avoid rape and protect rape victims in a godless universe. And this serves the function of a philosophical moral standard, whether or not it technically is one. Now I know this is an irritating topic. The statement is insulting, there's no good reason for it, and I'd say those who formulated the idea are total pieces of shit. But many Christians are just repeating it as they try to make sense of their faith in terms of a simplified idea of morality that it instills in them. Remember that, as much as I mock these ideas for the sake of helping us process the problems with them, the Christian people we interact with deserve our courtesy and may one day join our ranks.